Hello everyone and welcome. So today we're going to discuss a Subaru swap into my 1987 Volkswagen Westy camper. We're specifically going to discuss the wiring harness and if it's something that you can do yourself or it's something that you're going to need to send out and have someone do for you. So let's get into it. So you want to do a Subaru swap into your Vanagon. Great idea. What do? You get more reliability, you get better power. Yeah, I've done it once and it was awesome. But what does it take to actually do it? Well, the engine side seems to be mostly relatively straightforward for most people. But the area that is a little more complicated is the wiring harness. And what does that take? Well, for starters, you need a donor car. So this wiring harness and engine came out of a 2003 Subaru Outback wagon. So once you have a donor car, well, you got to pull the harness. And it's a relatively straightforward job, but it does take a little time and quite a bit of disassembly. So the harness starts in the engine compartment with these 5 connectors. We have the 2 major engine connectors, and then we have some O2 connectors. So from there, the harness goes back and then passes through the firewall with this connector here. It then goes down to the ECU, which is located on the right side on the floor, on the passenger side. The harness then extends all the way to the left side of the car to where the main power junction box is. So in order to get this harness out, you basically have to remove the entire dashboard. It's quite a bit of disassembly. You have to do a little cutting. You got to remove a lot of stuff and you kind of destroy the car. But it's a donor car anyway, and it'll probably go into the junkyard, so I guess that doesn't really matter. So once you manage to extract the harness from the car, you're going to need to go through it and remove a majority of the wires. Probably 70% of the wires that you remove, you're not really going to need. And it's going to look something like this. There's a huge load of wires that you're going to remove as part of the harness, but they're going to get removed. So for starters, you're going to have to unwrap the harness. Not too complicated, but you just got to be careful doing it. You're going to use some scissors, some diagonal cutters, and then you're going to very carefully use a blade. But you don't want to nick any of the wires, and you just want to be super careful doing that, especially wires that have anything to do with the ECU or any of the other functions that you're going to need. But a lot of wires you're not going to be using, so you can't do that. So once you do get the harness entirely stripped, most of the wires are going to terminate on both ends and you're just going to remove them. It's pretty straightforward. So that's going to be a large percentage of the wires. Once you remove all those, you are going to have a series of wires that tee in, like for example, this wire, it tees in to either power or ground. And what I typically do, I'll just trim those and then I'll flag them because this connection here will need to be repaired before the harness is done. We'll also label all the connectors for the ECU. And there's 4 major connectors and they're A, B, C, and D, 134 through 137. And we'll also label all the other things. We'll label the other components that are part of the system. OBD2 connector. This is the fuel pump relay. We'll come over here and then we'll have the main, this is the main relay, the main power relay. So as we move forward with the harness, we're basically going to have 4 groups of wires that are not part of the primary harness. So the first group would be wires such as these that I've coiled up. So all these are wires that go into the ECU, but they are not used for our application. So these wires will either be depinned and removed or just cut back and deactivated. So those will all go away. We also have a second set of wires, which is these 4. And these are all wires that do go to the ECU, but they are external to the harness, and these will get connected to the Vanagon harness. And those would include the check engine light, there's a VSS speed sensor, air conditioning switch, and then the tachometer. There's a 4th set of wires over here, and these are from the Subaru harness, but these will also go to the, and these don't originate at the ECU. These originate at the engine, and these two are the low oil pressure light, and this one basically grounds out when there's no oil pressure. And then this is the Subaru gauge temp, which you can use the Subaru Center from what I understand, as long as you put a resistor in there. So these will also get connected to the Vanagon harness. And then we have a fourth set of wires, and these are wires that are used in the system, and they will need to stay, but if they're not addressed, they will cause faults. And there's a couple companies that make a little circuit board that has resistors on them to kind of trick the ECU to think that these systems are still installed when they're not really installed, because these are going to go away, but we still need the wires. So these include the cooling fans 1 and 2. It includes fuel temperature, fuel level, fuel tank pressure sensor, and then we have a power and we have a ground. And those will all get connected to the code killer. So at this point in my harness, I'm getting close to thinking about forming it. I've identified all the wires. I do need to shorten the OBD2 portion of it, because this is actually very long. So that's going to get shortened up. I have ordered the code killer, so that'll come. These wires are also very long, so I'll have to trim that up. So I have to start molding it and shortening it and getting it ready to a configuration that will be able to install into the van. Once I do that and I receive my code killer, I will do a very preliminary test and add power. I will jumper the test leads and just see if everything, not everything, but see if the basic functions are working, primarily the relay cycling, and some other basic things working. So if this is something you think you're going to do, you're going to need some basic tools. I would say you're going to need a multimeter, because you're going to need to ring out some wires and trace them back to the ECU. And the process does require some double checking and maybe even triple checking of wires in your harness, just to make sure everything is exactly right. Because if you do make a mistake in the harness, obviously the repercussions are pretty significant. Your engine may not run, or just may run badly. So it has to be exactly right. You're obviously going to need a soldering iron, and you're going to have to know how to solder. So there's a lot of videos out there that you can watch how to solder properly. But there is going to be some degree of soldering, because you do have to repair wires that have multiple splices, and then you're also going to have to shorten wires. Probably going to need a heat gun too, because you're going to have different heat shrink that you're going to have to insulate wires, so that'll be important. Although this is not really required, you probably should have a power supply so you can just do different tests, and it'll make it way easier than rigging up a battery or something. Something that I purchased from one of the Vanagon Subaru vendors is instructions on actually how to do the harness. Although you don't actually have to have this, it will make it a lot easier, and especially if you've never done it before, it will give you some pretty good information. And basically it's a pinout of the ECU and all the what all the pinouts do and where they go. And this one is color coded, so it does make it pretty easy. Also gives you some basic instructions and what the harness should look like. So you'll also are going to need a pinout specifically. This is from the manual, from the Subaru manual, but this is a pinout, and it tells you, what all these ECU outputs, what they do and the ranges. And then also what's very important is basically the engine electrical wiring diagram, and this goes over all the sensors that are associated with the engine operation. And I've already gone through it and made some notes, and it just helps you determine what wires you need, don't need, and what they do. So if you're not clear on that. So hopefully this overview of the wiring harness for the Subaru installation into Vanagon was helpful to you. You need to determine if it's something that you think you can take on or not. You can send it out and have someone do it. It's going to cost you a little money, but if you're not comfortable doing it or don't really have the confidence, then send it out and have someone do it. it definitely beats having a harness that has problems. If you do it yourself, you will need some attention to detail, and you will need some focus, because it does require you to get into the wires and focus for an amount of time and just to get everything right. So that's it. Thanks very much, guys, and we'll see you later.